Mary Scott was an ordinary woman, but one mistake turned her life into a nightmare. What happened to her will leave you speechless. Watch to the end to uncover the chilling truth. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Mary Scott had always known that life would not be easy for her. Growing up in the heart of Detroit in the early 1900s, she had learned early that being black and a woman meant fighting twice as hard for everything. She had dreams, big dreams of success, of owning her own business, of making a name for herself, but the world around her had already decided what she could and could not be. And if that wasn't enough, she had one more burden to carry: epilepsy. It wasn't just an illness. It was a curse in the eyes of many. Some whispered that it was a sign of demons, a punishment for sins she had never committed. Others simply feared her, recoiling at the sight of her convulsions crossing the street to avoid her as if epilepsy were contagious. But Mary refused to let their fears define her. She worked harder than anyone she knew, holding down 2 jobs, pushing through the exhaustion, and saving every penny. No one would tell her what she could and could not do. But that summer night in 1920, life proved that no amount of determination could control fate. Mary had spent the entire day at work, balancing her job as a seamstress during the day and cleaning offices at night. By the time she got home, the weight of exhaustion crushed her. She had barely kicked off her shoes before collapsing onto the bed, her body surrendering to fatigue. In her exhaustion, she forgot something crucial: her medication. She always took it before bed. It was a ritual, a habit so ingrained in her that she did it almost without thinking. But that night, she was too drained to remember, too tired to even move. The seizure came suddenly, like a lightning bolt through her brain. Her body jerked violently, her limbs flailing against the sheets as her back arched in an unnatural spasm. Her teeth clenched, and a strangled gasp escaped her throat. It was a storm inside her, a battle she had fought countless times before. But this time, there was no one to help her. She had installed a bell above her bed for moments like this. If she felt a seizure coming, she could press it, alerting her neighbors. Through sheer willpower, her trembling fingers managed to press it before her body gave out completely. The neighbors heard the frantic ringing. They knew what it meant. Rushing to her apartment, they banged on the door, calling her name, but there was no answer. Fear gripping them, they forced their way inside, only to find Mary's still body on the floor. Her chest barely moved, her breath shallow, her skin ashen. One of the women screamed. Another neighbor ran to call a doctor. By the time Dr. Briggs arrived, the apartment was eerily silent. He pressed 2 fingers to Mary's throat, feeling for a pulse. There was nothing. He listened for breathing. Nothing. He checked her pupils, unresponsive. Dr. Briggs let out a long, regretful sigh and turned to the neighbors. "She's gone," he said simply. The words cut through the air like a knife. Some gasped, others covered their mouths in shock. The woman who had called for help began to cry, blaming herself for not getting there sooner. Mary Scott, strong, determined Mary, was dead. The doctor signed the death certificate right then and there. No autopsy, no second opinions, no hesitation. He was certain. The news spread through the neighborhood quickly. By sunrise, preparations for the funeral had already begun. The tragedy of Mary Scott's death was whispered from doorstep to doorstep, her life reduced to a story of what could have been. And just like that, before she even had the chance to fight, Mary Scott was gone. The morning of Mary Scott's funeral was heavy with grief. The sun shone brightly over Detroit, But for those who had gathered, the light felt out of place. A sorrowful silence hung in the air as neighbors, friends, and distant relatives made their way to the small church at the edge of town. The wooden casket, simple yet elegant, lay at the front of the church, surrounded by white lilies. Some whispered prayers, others wiped away silent tears. The news of Mary's passing had spread quickly, and despite the whispers of superstition that followed her in life, many had come to say their final goodbyes. Her sister, Evelyn, was still on her way. She had boarded a train the night before, desperate to make it in time, but fate had not been kind. Delays had set her back, and as the minutes ticked by, the possibility of her arriving before the burial seemed more and more unlikely. The congregation waited, casting glances toward the entrance, but eventually the priest decided they could wait no longer. The funeral service began. The priest spoke of Mary's kindness, her strength, and the struggles she had endured. He did not mention the rumors, the way people had shunned her after her seizures, the way they had feared what they did not understand. Instead, he painted the image of a woman who had worked tirelessly to make something of herself despite all odds. But even as he spoke, there was unease in the air. Some in the crowd had never truly accepted Mary in life, and their presence at her funeral felt more like obligation than mourning. At last, the time had come. The pallbearers lifted the casket, carrying it toward the burial site just behind the church. The earth had already been dug, a gaping hole waiting to swallow the dead. As the priest said the final rites, the casket was slowly lowered into the ground. The first handful of dirt was tossed onto the lid. A dull thud echoed in the silence. Then another, and another. Just as the grave was nearly halfway filled, a cry rang through the air. "Stop!" Heads turned sharply as Evelyn came running toward them, her face streaked with sweat and tears. She pushed past the startled mourners, breathless, desperate. "I need to see her," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please, just one last time." The priest hesitated, glancing at the funeral director. It was unusual to exhume a casket once it had been placed in the ground, but the sheer grief in Evelyn's eyes swayed him. After a brief, whispered discussion, the decision was made. The workers moved quickly, pulling ropes to lift the casket back out of the earth. The crowd murmured in curiosity, some shifting uncomfortably. A few whispered that disturbing the dead was a bad omen. Others simply watched, their expressions unreadable. The lid was unfastened, the screws turned slowly, the wood creaking under the pressure. The air felt thick, as if something unnatural was about to unfold. The moment stretched into eternity as one of the funeral workers lifted the lid. A loud, guttural gasp filled the air. Mary sat up. For a split second, no one moved. No one breathed. The world stood still. Then, all at once, the churchyard erupted in screams. People stumbled over each other, clawing to get away. Some collapsed in sheer shock. The priest dropped his Bible, his mouth forming silent prayers as he scrambled backward. A woman fainted on the spot. Even the men who had opened the casket turned white with terror. Mary, confused, looked around at the chaos. Her eyes searched for something familiar, and then she saw her sister. Evelyn, standing frozen, hands trembling, her face torn between disbelief and overwhelming emotion. "Evie?" Mary's voice was hoarse, weak but alive, but Evelyn wasn't the only one looking. Dozens of eyes were on her now, filled with something more than fear. Horror, superstition, pure, primal dread. Mary tried to speak again, but the reaction was immediate. The priest turned and ran, nearly tripping over his robe. The remaining mourners fled in all directions, screaming about the dead walking again. Mary staggered out of the casket, still weak, still trying to understand what was happening. But every step she took only made it worse. People shrieked as if the devil himself had risen. Some crossed themselves, others shouted that she was a curse, a demon, an abomination. A single phrase rang through the air, chilling Mary to the bone. She wasn't meant to come back. Evelyn was the only one who didn't run, but even she hesitated, her hand shaken as she reached toward her sister. Mary took another step forward. A man yelled, throwing his hat to the ground as he turned and bolted. The hysteria spread like wildfire. They didn't see a woman. They saw something unnatural. Mary's heart pounded. She had barely escaped death, and now she was being chased by fear itself. She turned and ran, her body still weak from what had happened. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. Behind her, the screams still echoed. And for the first time in her life, Mary Scott feared the living more than she had ever feared death. Mary ran. Her legs were weak, her body still sluggish from whatever had happened to her, but the fear coursing through her veins pushed her forward. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know who to turn to. The only thing she knew for certain was that she could not stay there, surrounded by people who looked at her like she was something unnatural. The air was thick with their screams, the weight of their terror pressing down on her as she stumbled through the narrow streets of Detroit. She reached the small apartment building where she had lived for years, hoping for some sense of familiarity, some moment to breathe. But as soon as she stepped through the door, she knew that home would no longer be a refuge. The building's caretaker, an older woman who had always greeted her with kindness, gasped at the sight of her and slammed the door to her own apartment shut. A neighbor peeked out from behind a curtain, eyes wide with disbelief before disappearing inside. From the hallway, whispers began to spread. "She's back. I saw them bury her. This isn't natural." Mary reached her apartment and locked the door behind her. The familiar space should have brought comfort, but it only felt suffocating. She caught her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with exhaustion and confusion. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat hammer against her ribs. She was alive, she knew that. But why didn't anyone else believe it? A knock at the door sent her heart leaping into her throat. For a moment, she was too afraid to answer. Then, a voice. "Mary?" It was Evelyn. She hesitated before unlocking the door. As soon as it opened, Evelyn threw her arms around her, holding her so tightly that Mary could barely breathe. "I thought I lost you," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. Mary clung to her sister, the first and only person who had looked at her with love instead of horror. "I don't understand," she murmured. "I woke up, and everyone, they ran from me. What's happening, Evie?" Evelyn pulled back, studying her face. "They think you're something else." Her voice wavered, the words difficult to say. "They think you were supposed to stay dead." Mary's stomach twisted. "That's ridiculous. You don't believe that, do you?" Evelyn shook her head immediately. "Of course not. You're my sister. I know you." But there was something in her eyes, something haunted. "But Mary, things like this don't happen. People don't just come back." Mary took a shaky breath. "I never left." Evelyn stayed with her that night, refusing to let Mary be alone. The two of them huddled in the dimly lit apartment, speaking in hushed voices, trying to piece together what had happened. Mary had no memory of being buried, no recollection of the time she had supposedly been dead. She only remembered the darkness, the cold, and then waking up to screams. Outside, the city wasn't quiet. Whispers had turned into rumors. Rumors had turned into fear. The funeral had been attended by too many people. Word spread quickly. People avoided the building, crossing the street rather than walking too close. Some claimed they had seen her silhouette in the window, a shadow of something unnatural. Others said she was cursed, a woman who had made a deal with the devil himself to return. The next morning, Mary tried to go back to work. She had no choice. She had to keep moving forward. She dressed in her usual clothes, smoothed her hair, and left the apartment with Evelyn by her side. But the moment she arrived at the shop where she had worked for years, everything changed. The other workers stopped what they were doing. The manager's face drained of color. He took one look at her, his hands trembling, and shook his head. "Mary, you shouldn't be here." Mary's chest tightened. "But I work here." The manager hesitated. Then, quietly, he said, "Not anymore." The words hit her like a slap. "You're firing me?" His gaze flickered around nervously. "I don't want any trouble. People are talking, Mary. They're afraid. I don't know what happened to you, but I can't have you here." Mary's hands clenched into fists. "Because I didn't die?" The manager exhaled shakily. "Because people believe you did." Anger bubbled beneath her skin. But what could she do? They weren't listening. They never had. She left without another word, feeling every pair of eyes following her as she stepped back onto the street. She had fought for everything she had in this life, and in a single moment, it had all been taken away. It wasn't just her job. It was the world itself that seemed to be pushing her away. When she and Evelyn walked through town, people either averted their eyes or stared openly. Some whispered, crossing themselves as she passed. Others didn't even bother whispering. She should have stayed in the ground. That isn't Mary Scott anymore. The devil let her come back. Mary tried to ignore them, but the weight of their words pressed on her like lead. When Sunday arrived, Evelyn suggested they go to church. If people see you there, maybe they'll realize you're just you. Maybe they'll remember who you are. Mary wasn't sure. She had spent her whole life proving herself to people who refused to listen. But maybe Evelyn was right. Maybe they needed to see her in a place of faith, to believe she wasn't something to fear. So they went. The moment they stepped through the doors, silence fell over the congregation. Every head turned. For a brief moment, Mary dared to hope that this time would be different. But then, a woman in the front pew let out a shrieking wail. "No! She's back! She's back from the dead!" Panic exploded. People scrambled for the exit, knocking over benches, pushing past one another in their rush to flee. The priest staggered backward, clutching his cross as if it would protect him. Some collapsed in the chaos. Others cried out prayers, pleading for protection. Mary stood frozen, watching it all unfold. She saw their terror, their revulsion, their absolute certainty that she was something unnatural. She wasn't. She was Mary, but they would never see her as that again. Evelyn grabbed her hand, pulling her away, whispering, "Let's go. Please, Mary, let's go." They stepped outside, and Mary took a shuddering breath. She hadn't come back from the dead, but the world had already decided, and she had no idea how to live in it anymore. The weight of the past never truly leaves. For years, Mary Scott learned to live in the shadows, not because she wanted to, but because the world had left her no choice. She was alive, but not in the way others were. She was a ghost in the eyes of the city, a specter that walked among them, tolerated but never accepted. She had stopped fighting to make them see her as anything else. Evelyn, never left her side. In the beginning, she tried to convince people, tried to reason with them, but the whispers never stopped. They only grew softer, more secretive, more insidious. They stopped running from Mary, but they never let her forget that she was different. She would walk into a shop, and the room would grow silent. She would try to find work, but the answer was always the same. Doors closed, faces turned away. Hands made the sign of the cross when they thought she wasn't looking. Decades passed, and Mary learned to live in the space between life and legend. She stopped trying to change their minds. She found ways to survive, small sewing jobs for those who didn't care about the rumors, deliveries at night when fewer eyes were on her. She and Evelyn lived quietly in a house on the edge of town, where no one had to see them if they didn't want to. Time moved forward, but the past never loosened its grip. Even after new generations were born, the stories remained. Parents warned their children not to go near her house. Strangers whispered when they saw her in the market. And always the same hushed murmur. She wasn't meant to come back. Mary never had children. She never married. The life she had dreamed of before that fateful night had never been hers to claim. She had outlived many of those who had feared her, but their fear had lived on. And then, one day, she felt the end coming. She was 70 years old when sickness finally took hold of her body. It wasn't sudden, but slow, like a whisper creeping through her bones. The doctors were hesitant, as if they too feared another mistake. But this time there was no doubt. Mary was dying. And this time she would not return. She spent her last days in the small home she shared with Evelyn, looking out the window, watching the world she had never truly been a part of. She wasn't afraid. She had already faced death once. She had faced worse than death. Evelyn sat beside her, holding her hand, refusing to let go even as Mary's breaths grew shallow. In those final moments, Mary spoke softly, her voice no louder than the wind. They never stopped believing I was something else. Evelyn's grip tightened. It doesn't matter what they think. Mary's lips curled in the faintest of smiles. It always mattered. Just not to me anymore. She closed her eyes. This time, she did not wake up. The funeral was small. No crowds, no hysteria, just Evelyn, and a handful of people who had come to know Mary as more than the stories told about her. There was no fear this time, no screams or running. The city had changed, but not enough. Even in death, she was still a myth. Decades later, children still whispered her name. People still avoided her grave. They told stories about the woman who had been buried twice, the one who had risen from the dead, the one who had never belonged. And when the wind passed through the trees at night, carrying the echoes of a name that refused to be forgotten, people still turned away and muttered, "She wasn't meant to come back." Mary's story is a chilling reminder that fear and superstition can outlive even the truth. What do you think about what happened to her? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.